A billionaire in Manhattan thinks he knows everyone in his world, until his fiancée tries to destroy a hotel worker in front of cameras, and the new employee, Imani Reed, steps in. The room goes silent. The next day, receipts vanish, donations don't match, and a hidden file carries Sienna's name. Then Imani discovers the truth. Sienna isn't just cruel, she's done this before. Now the billionaire must choose, protect his empire or protect the people she's crushing. Stay with us until the end to see the moment her mask finally falls. The Pierce Grand was a machine of illusion that night, engineered to perfection. Cameras blinked like artificial stars, and the gentle hum of wealth murmured beneath every toast, every handshake. The gala wasn't just about donations, it was a performance of power, precision, and image. Graham Pierce stood at its center like a modern prince, polished, controlled, desirable. And somewhere among the polished shoes and vintage champagne, Imani Reed moved like water, fluid, unseen, trained to observe without making waves. She didn't belong to their world, not really, but she played her role with flawless discipline until the air changed. It was subtle, like the flick of a switch backstage. She caught it before others did. Sienna Cole's eyes, sharp and hungry, zeroed in on an older server named Noah Brooks, a man who'd served the Pierces for over a decade. Sienna's smile bloomed, sweet and venomous, as she called Noah out, her voice laced with fake concern. "Noah," she said, loud enough for attention, "why was this necklace found behind your station?" And just like that, the music faded, not in volume, but in meaning. Noah stammered, denying it, voice shaking like he could feel his life folding in real time. Imani felt the walls breathe in, the crowd beginning to circle like sharks scented blood. No one moved to defend him, not the guests, not the other staff, not even security. That was the real rule at the Pierce Grand. Silence maintained order. Imani had lived too long obeying rules like that, rules designed to keep people like her compliant, quiet, grateful. Her chest tightened as she watched Noah shrink into himself, palms open like he could plead the truth into existence. But when his eyes darted, not to Sienna, not to Graham, but to the exit, Imani felt it like a trigger. That look wasn't just fear, it was survival. It was a man calculating whether he could make it to the door without losing everything. And in that moment, something primal and furious broke free inside her. She stepped forward right between Noah and Sienna, her voice firm but respectful. "Do you have the footage?" she asked, steady as steel. Security cameras would have seen if anything was taken. Her question sliced through the room like a dropped glass. For a second, no one spoke. Sienna blinked, lips parting in a smile that never touched her eyes. "Excuse me?" she said, voice dripping silk. "You're interrupting something." Imani didn't back down. "You're making an accusation in front of donors. Surely there's proof." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Sienna's eyes hardened in an instant, her smile freezing into place like a photograph gone cold. She took one step closer, voice a notch lower now. "You're new here, aren't you?" she murmured, so only Imani and Noah could hear. "Let me give you advice. Don't confuse courage with career suicide." Imani stood still. Her pulse was hammering, but she didn't flinch. Not because she was brave, but because something deeper had been cracked open. A memory of her younger brother, Miles, crying when they took her away from their foster home. She had promised him she'd come back for him one day. She had promised she would build a life strong enough to carry them both. And here she was, watching another man be torn down for sport. She looked Sienna dead in the eye and said, "Then fire me. But you're not doing this to him without a single fact." Across the room, glasses were half raised. Conversations died mid-sentence. People were watching now, not with judgment but curiosity. This wasn't supposed to happen. Staff didn't speak back. Sienna's fingers tightened around her clutch. "I think I'll speak to Mr. Pierce directly." she said through clenched teeth. But she didn't move. Not yet. Her performance was unraveling. And that's when Graham looked up. He had been across the ballroom, engaged in discussion with the senator's chief of staff, smiling with that practiced ease that made people trust him. But something about the shift in the crowd's attention made him glance toward the disruption. He didn't see Sienna first. He saw Imani. Her posture, rigid, protective, Noah's expression, humiliated, scared. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a spectacle. Graham excused himself politely and started walking toward them, eyes narrowing slightly as he registered the dynamics at play. Sienna's voice rose, as if reclaiming her audience. "I just want clarity," she said brightly. "There's no need to dramatize. Surely you agree, Graham." But Graham didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on Noah, who was still trembling, and then on Imani, whose jaw was set with quiet defiance. "I'd like to see the security report before any assumptions are made," Graham said finally, voice calm but final. Sienna laughed, just a breath too loud. "Darling, I wasn't accusing—" "You were," Imani said quietly, not to him, but to Sienna. "You said theft." Sienna's smile cracked for half a second before she turned on her heel and stalked away, whispering something to an aide. Graham didn't follow her. After the confrontation dissolved into uncomfortable murmurs and reawakened conversation, Graham turned to Imani, eyes studying her as if he were seeing her for the first time. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone unreadable. "Imani Reed," she said, lifting her chin. He nodded once. "Thank you, Imani." Then he turned to Noah. "We'll review the cameras. You're not to be removed from tonight's staff." Noah's face crumpled with relief, and he looked at Imani like she'd just pulled him out of floodwater. But Graham's eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he walked away. No reprimand, no empty apology, just awareness. And something deeper, like the foundation of his carefully curated world, had been subtly, irreversibly shifted. The crowd slowly returned to their polished routines, but the atmosphere had changed. A line had been crossed, not loudly, not with fire, but with a single act of defiance that had exposed something ugly beneath all the wealth and glamour. Imani took a deep breath, hands trembling only now that it was over. She turned to Noah, gently rested a hand on his arm, and whispered, "You're okay now." It wasn't true, not fully. But for that moment it was enough. As the gala resumed, its surface repaired but never quite the same, Imani felt the weight of what she'd done begin to settle in her bones. The cameras still flashed, the music swelled, but she no longer moved through the ballroom like a shadow. Eyes followed her now, not all kindly. She had made herself visible, and with that visibility came risk. Still, beneath the fear, there was something steadier. She had done the right thing. And across the room, where Graham Pierce had returned to his conversation but no longer seemed entirely present, a seed had been planted. It would grow in silence over the next few days, in glances, in hesitation, in questions that couldn't be ignored. But it had begun here, with a necklace that never existed, an accusation meant to humiliate, and one woman who chose not to look away. One small act of courage had landed like a match in a room full of gas. The next morning, everything felt off. The ballroom's lights and flutes of champagne were already distant memories, like a dream Imani couldn't quite place. The penthouse, in contrast, was hushed in a different way. Not peaceful, not quiet with luxury, but with caution. A kind of silence that spoke between the words people were too afraid to say aloud. Imani noticed it first in the way the elevator attendant avoided her eyes. Then again in how the cook barely nodded when she entered the private kitchen. It wasn't hostility, it was warning. Darlene Price, head of housekeeping and someone Imani had barely exchanged a dozen words with, folded linens in the guest suite while Imani stood nearby. Darlene's hands slowed, smoothing the sheet far longer than necessary. "Some things around here are Delicate, she said without looking up. Her voice was soft but carried a weight Imani couldn't miss. Delicate things break fast if you grab them too tight. Then she glanced at Imani for just a second, eyes full of worry, and went back to her work. That was the rule being taught. Discretion, obedience, silence. But Imani wasn't sure she had it in her to follow it, not anymore. By noon, a message arrived through the intercom. Ms. Cole would like to see you in her dressing room. Not please, not at your convenience. Just a statement, like gravity. Imani made her way up the second staircase, heart in her throat, but spine held high. Sienna's dressing room was a shrine to curated perfection. Rows of color-coordinated garments, perfume bottles displayed like trophies, and in the center, the woman herself, seated at her vanity like a monarch. She didn't greet Imani with hostility. Instead, she smiled, a gentle, amused curve of the lips that made Imani's stomach tighten in instinctive rejection. "You certainly made an impression last night," Sienna said sweetly, applying gloss to already perfect lips. "Graham hasn't stopped asking about you." Her tone wasn't jealousy. It was possession, like Graham was hers to manage, and Imani had dented the packaging. "You were passionate," she continued, standing to approach Imani slowly, her heels soundless on the carpet. "But you should know, in this world, scenes aren't appreciated. Not by the guests, not by the staff, and definitely not by Graham." She paused in front of Imani, looking her up and down with cold elegance. "People who make themselves visible tend to disappear quickly." Then she smiled again and returned to her vanity as if she hadn't just threatened her. Imani walked back to the staff quarters with her fists clenched and her jaw locked. The words rang in her ears like a curse, but she couldn't let them rattle her. Not too much. Not yet. She sat on the edge of her cot, the one assigned to her in the small suite shared by 2 other staff members, and opened the drawer beside it. Inside, tucked under her daily planner, was the photo, the only one she carried. Her brother Miles, 16 now, grinning with a crooked smile full of braces. His eyes were wide with youth and the need to believe that someone out there was fighting for him. She had made a promise to him in a whisper years ago, before child services had moved them to different foster homes. "I'll come back for you. I'll make it work. Just hold on." And he had. For 6 years he had held on. Imani pressed the photo flat with her fingers, smoothing the wrinkled edges like she could erase the time lost between them. She wasn't here for Graham or for glamour. She was here to earn enough, to stabilize, to build something real, something permanent. Sienna could have her kingdom of smoke and mirrors. Imani had something to protect that actually mattered. Dinner service that evening was quieter than usual. No music, no laughter from the staff lounge. Everyone felt the shift. Whispers spread faster than wine, and even those who weren't in the ballroom last night had heard. Imani caught glances, some sympathetic, others cautious, a few openly resentful. Darlene brought her a bowl of soup during break and sat beside her without asking. "You're good at what you do," she said quietly, not looking at her. "But people here got mouths to feed. They can't afford to get dragged into something that isn't theirs." Imani nodded. She understood. She had no right to expect anyone to risk their jobs for her. She hadn't even meant to take a stand. It had just happened. "I know," she said. "I'm not trying to make trouble." Darlene finally looked at her, something soft in her gaze. "Sometimes you don't have to try. Trouble finds you when you don't kneel fast enough." Imani let out a breath, equal parts exhaustion and frustration. "She threatened me today." Darlene tilted her head. "Not with words, not ones that matter." And that was the truth of it. The danger wasn't in what Sienna said. It was in what she didn't have to. Later that night, the hallways were still and dim as Imani walked back from the guest wing. Her shift had ended, but sleep felt far away. She had just turned the corner near the east stairwell when she nearly collided with someone coming in the opposite direction. Graham. Dressed down for once. Slacks, open collar, no tie, no armor. His hand instinctively reached out to steady her before quickly withdrawing. "Sorry," he said. His voice wasn't cold or stiff, just quiet. Surprised. Imani nodded, stepping back to give him space. "It's fine." He hesitated just for a moment. Then his mouth opened slightly, like he was about to say something. She waited, heart knocking once against her ribs. But the words didn't come. His eyes flicked toward her face, searching almost. But then he just nodded again, gently, and continued past her. Imani stood there for a long second, alone in the corridor, the moment suspended like a breath held too long. That silence had said more than any apology could. It told her he'd seen what happened. It told her he wasn't ready to speak up. And it told her she was on her own. For now. Imani went back to her small staff room and opened the drawer where she kept a single photo, worn at the edges, her teenage brother Miles, grinning with braces and hope, taken during one of her rare visits to his foster home. She pressed the photo flat, as if she could smooth the past into something safe. She had taken this job to build a life sturdy enough to bring him home, to finally keep the promise she whispered to him when she was 17 and terrified. That night, Graham passed Imani in the hallway and paused like he wanted to say something, then didn't. His silence landed heavier than words. Imani's workload doubled without warning. The kind of shift that came dressed as opportunity but carried an unmistakable scent of surveillance. She was pulled from her usual tasks and reassigned to the administrative offices for a special audit assist related to the gala's finances. The assignment came directly from Landon Klein, the CFO, who smiled too long and spoke too vaguely. "Just a little cleanup," he said, tapping the folders like they were dusted relics. "Graham wants everything spotless for the quarterly board review. You're sharp, figured you'd catch what others missed." The implications settled heavy on her shoulders. This was either a test or a trap. But she nodded and accepted, fingers steady as she opened the first folder. At first glance, it was routine, donor names, check amounts, receipt confirmations, but as she flipped through the paperwork, patterns began to fray. There were missing check numbers, deposits that didn't align with recorded donations, and entries that appeared twice in the public-facing summary, but only once in the internal ledger. It didn't feel like sloppy bookkeeping. It felt intentional. Like someone had gone through with a scalpel, carving out what didn't belong, leaving just enough behind to fool anyone not looking too closely. Only she was looking now, and she couldn't unsee what she'd seen. Imani didn't say anything that first afternoon. Instead, she moved carefully, photocopying the inconsistencies and setting the originals back exactly as she found them. She kept her pace even, her face calm. She knew from foster homes and temp jobs that nothing drew suspicion faster than looking suspicious. But inside, her mind raced. These weren't accidental mismatches. Someone had gone through and manipulated totals with surgical precision. She recognized 2 donor names from the gala, names that had been heavily promoted in press releases. But their actual donations were far less than what had been reported. One had even bounced, and yet both were listed as gold sponsors in the public recap. She took a pencil and started marking a page lightly, just dots in the corners, to remember what to revisit later. It was subtle work, methodical, and increasingly personal. Because the deeper she went, the more she realized this wasn't just a fraud against numbers. It was a fraud that wore the face of charity, one that smiled at cameras while diverting funds from real people and real needs. That was what made her hands tremble just slightly as she turned the pages. Not the fear of exposure, but the rage at the audacity. She had just finished copying a suspicious bundle of invoices when the door behind her creaked open and she felt a presence, too confident to be staff. Imani turned slowly and found herself face to face with Sienna Cole. Dressed in muted cream silk and heels that never seemed to scuff, Sienna looked like she'd floated in from another, more glamorous dimension. "Hard at work, I see," she said, voice warm enough to burn. She strolled toward the desk and let her fingers trace along the folders like a pianist playing a familiar melody. "Accounting is so dry, isn't it? All those little numbers." Imani didn't respond right away, unsure whether to lie or deflect. Sienna plucked a folder, one Imani had just finished reviewing, and opened it carelessly. "These things get so messy when too many eyes are on them. Best to let the right people handle the math." Her tone never changed, but her eyes flicked up with unmistakable weight. "We wouldn't want to distract Graham with questions he doesn't need to worry about. He has enough on his plate, don't you think?" Imani held her ground, even as her chest tightened. "Of course," she replied evenly, "just making sure everything lines up." Sienna smiled, almost sadly. "Good girl." After she left, Imani sat frozen for a moment, replaying the encounter. Every word had been coated in sugar, but the message had cut like glass. She knew now, without a shadow of doubt, that Sienna had something to do with the altered records. The casual way she dismissed the discrepancies, the familiarity with the files, the gentle intimidation laced into each sentence. It was too precise. Sienna had come not to check on the files, but to check on Imani, and that realization felt like a door slamming shut. She couldn't report this to HR, it would go straight to Landon, and he was part of the same closed loop. She couldn't tell Graham, he wasn't ready to hear it, or worse, he already knew and chose to look away. Imani stood, walked to the staff locker room, and opened her personal drawer. Inside, beneath her spare apron and a few crumpled receipts from lunches she hadn't had time to eat, she kept a worn paperback novel. She peeled back the inside cover and tucked a fresh page of copied numbers there, folding it twice before pressing it flat. Then she opened her small black notebook, the one she used like a confession box, and began recording the day's findings. If she couldn't trust anyone yet, she'd build her own record. By the end of the week, she had filled 3 hidden pages with irregularities, duplicated entries, non-existent grants, donation dates that didn't match any event on the calendar. But she had also learned to walk slower, to speak less, and to keep her expressions unreadable. She was being watched now, not by cameras, but by eyes that smiled too much and lingered too long. Landon made offhand comments about how impressive she was for someone without a financial background. Another assistant joked about her being groomed for something bigger. Even the cook, normally aloof, offered her an extra coffee with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The air had changed. Imani wasn't invisible anymore, and in this world, visibility came with consequences. She kept the files hidden, rotating their locations every other day, sometimes in the novel, sometimes in a cleaning supply drawer, once even inside a zipped pillow cover in the linen closet. It was exhausting, and it was lonely, but it felt necessary. Because something told her the truth, once uncovered, wouldn't just cost someone a job, it would threaten everything holding this house together. When Sienna appeared at her shoulder, wearing silk and confidence, she plucked a folder from the stack, as if she owned the truth inside it. Her voice stayed pleasant as she told Imani to stop digging into boring accounting, and her fingers drifted over the pages, as if searching for what Imani had already seen. After Sienna left, Imani pulled out a small notebook she kept hidden beneath her uniform drawer, the one where she wrote reminders to herself the way other people wrote prayers. She copied the missing figures carefully, then tore the page out and slid it behind the back lining of a hardcover book. It was the first secret she kept in that house, and it made her hands shake. Sienna's revenge didn't thunder into the hotel like a storm. It seeped in quietly, methodically, like poison in a drink you thought was safe. There were no public meltdowns or dramatic scenes. Her retaliation came dressed in protocol, wearing smiles. The first blow landed with a simple change in Noah's schedule. His weekend shifts, where he earned much-needed overtime, were reassigned without explanation. "Just a scheduling adjustment," the new shift manager mumbled when Noah asked, eyes darting away. The second hit came 2 days later. Darlene was pulled into a closed-door meeting and emerged pale, holding a disciplinary write-up for neglecting suite readiness. She hadn't even worked that floor that day. Still, she signed it. "It's fine," she told Imani afterward, her voice flat. Better to take the hit than make it worse. Meanwhile, staff who once greeted Imani with warmth began to retreat. Conversations cut off when she entered a room. Jokes died in throats. One barback even stepped away mid-sentence, muttering something about not wanting to get mixed up. Sienna, on the other hand, floated through it all like a benevolent queen. She offered compliments with just enough edge to make them cut. "Imani, you're so bold. I admire that, truly." But Imani could feel it, the blade beneath the praise. She tried to ignore it at first, tried to focus on her work, double-check her files, show up early and leave late. But the isolation pressed harder each day. What burned most wasn't the rumors, it was the silence. The way people who had once trusted her now watched their backs when she passed. It made her wonder if she'd misstepped somehow, if her intervention at the gala had painted a target on her that even allies couldn't afford to stand beside. One night, exhausted after a double shift, she entered the service corridor to grab a supply list and nearly tripped over someone sitting in the shadows. Noah. He was hunched on an overturned crate, phone in hand, face washed in the kind of stillness that came with bad news. "You good?" Imani asked quietly, stepping closer. He looked up, startled, then attempted a laugh that collapsed into something brittle. "Define good," he murmured, rubbing a hand over his face. She didn't push. Instead, she sat beside him and waited. After a minute, he turned the phone toward her. The screen showed a photo of a teenage girl, Lily, lying in a hospital bed, wires and IVs tangled in her arms. "Her numbers dropped," he whispered. "We can't afford another delay." Imani took the phone carefully, eyes fixed on the image. Lily was maybe 15, with a shaved head and eyes too big for her fragile frame. Her smile was trying, but it didn't reach all the way. "That's your sister?" Imani asked, though she already knew. He nodded. "Kidney failure. We were approved for this trial, but it's not covered. I've been picking up every extra shift I can just to keep her on the meds until the next evaluation. But now..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His voice cracked around the last word, and the silence after was heavier than anything she could have said. "They cut my hours, Imani, for no reason. None of it makes sense." His hands shook slightly, and he gripped his phone tighter as if it were the last thing tethering him to control. "I can't lose this job. If I do, she loses everything." Imani stared at him, heart clenching. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about injustice anymore. It was about survival. She had known Sienna's cruelty was calculated. But this, hurting someone's family through numbers and silence, this was monstrous. And it wasn't a system error. It was personal. It was intentional. Imani didn't speak right away. She felt the weight of what she was about to do before she said the words. She knew the cost. She could feel it in the air, in the way people flinched at her name, in the way Sienna's shadow stretched longer every day. But she also remembered miles. She remembered foster homes that didn't care if you ate. She remembered hospital bills that came with guilt instead of receipts. She looked Noah in the eye and said firmly but quietly, "I'm not going to let her do this to you." He blinked, like he didn't understand what he was hearing. "You can't promise that," he said, shaking his head. "You don't know what she's capable of." Imani's voice dropped lower. "I know exactly what she's capable of. That's why I'm not backing down." For a long moment, Noah just sat there, stunned. Then his shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in release, like someone who had been holding his breath for too long. "You're gonna get yourself fired," he said, not accusing, just afraid. Imani smiled, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe, but not today." That was all she could offer, and it was enough. They sat there a little longer, the kind of silence between two people who no longer had to pretend everything was okay. When Noah finally stood, he offered her a small nod, a flicker of something close to gratitude. "Thank you," he said. Two simple words, but they landed with weight. Imani nodded back. "We look out for each other. That's how this works." She meant it, and for the first time in days she felt grounded. She didn't have a plan yet, not one that would stop Sienna, but she had something just as dangerous: clarity. Sienna wasn't just vindictive, she was strategic. And now that Imani had seen the way she moved, she could start anticipating her next step. That alone gave her back a sliver of control. As she walked back to her room that night, she felt eyes on her again. But this time, she didn't look away. Let them see. Let them know. She wasn't afraid to be visible, not anymore. Imani found Noah in the service corridor late one night, sitting on an overturned crate, staring at his phone like it held the answer to everything. When she asked if he was okay, he tried to laugh and failed. He showed her a picture of his younger sister Lily in a hospital bed, pale under fluorescent lights, the kind of photo you take when you need proof to ask for help. He admitted that if he lost his job, she would lose her treatment, and then his voice broke on a word he didn't finish. Imani didn't offer him easy comfort. She offered something more dangerous. She looked him in the eye and promised, quietly, that she would not let Sienna destroy him. Noah's shoulders sagged with relief and fear all at once, because hope always comes with a price. The charity office wasn't part of Imani's usual rounds. It sat at the end of a corridor guests never wandered into, and most staff avoided, tucked behind a door that was always locked and always polished. People called it the Closet of Good Deeds, half-jokingly, like it held secrets too noble to question. Imani had passed it for weeks without giving it more than a glance, but ever since she began tracking the inconsistencies in the gala records, something about it itched at the back of her mind. She'd seen multiple files referencing grants and donor summaries that were supposed to be filed there, yet the numbers never matched what she saw in the public announcements. So, she waited. When the hallway cleared near midnight and no footsteps echoed nearby, she pulled out a slim master key she wasn't supposed to have. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was a shrine. Every wall was covered in framed photos. Graham with smiling children, Graham cutting ribbons at community centers, Graham shaking hands with politicians. It looked like a catalogue of virtue. But the desk in the center was what mattered. Dozens of folders were stacked neatly, labeled and color-coded, and one of them had Sienna's name on it. Imani sat at the desk and pulled the folder closer, heart pounding but eyes sharp. It was full of official-looking documents, grant applications, expense reports, foundation ledgers. At first, it looked legitimate. The numbers aligned, the wording was precise. But the deeper she read, the more subtle patterns unraveled. There were grant approvals signed off by non-existent board members, vendor invoices tied to suspicious addresses. One listed a flower shop that didn't appear on any city registry. There were donations sent from the foundation to what should have been schools or medical clinics, only to disappear into routing loops that led nowhere. It was the kind of fraud that required planning, layers of misdirection masked as charity. The most chilling part was how clean it looked. Sienna's name wasn't smeared over everything. It was woven in just enough to imply oversight, not control. But the timing of the transfers, the repetition of certain vendors, the matching signatures, it was too consistent to be coincidence. This wasn't sloppiness. This was a machine designed to look legitimate until someone like Imani read the fine print. And now she had, which meant she was a liability. She was mid-page in a stack of financial breakdowns when she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. Her blood froze. She didn't have time to hide the folder. She barely had time to stand. The door creaked open, and Landon Klein stepped inside. His brows lifted when he saw her, not in panic but in mild surprise, like he'd expected someone else. Then his eyes dropped to the folder in her hand. There was a beat of silence before his expression shifted. First to calculation, then to something neutral, practiced. "Imani," he said smoothly, closing the door behind him. "Working late?" She didn't answer. He walked toward the desk casually, the way someone might approach a stray animal, unsure whether to lure or leash. "This area's off limits outside of executive approval. I assume you didn't get that." Imani felt the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. "I was just verifying some inconsistencies," she said carefully. Something didn't add up. Landon smiled, not kindly. "You know, standing in here, going through those files without authorization, it's not a good look. Someone might think you were trying to steal sensitive information, or worse, alter it." He said it like a warning dressed as a favor. Imani didn't move, didn't blink. Her fingers tightened around the folder, but her voice stayed calm. "You think I'm going to take the fall for this?" Landon chuckled, not amused. "I think you should be careful. This hotel, it runs on perception. And Graham trusts Sienna. He trusts the board. He trusts me." His voice dipped lower. "He doesn't know you." Imani felt her stomach twist, but she kept her spine straight. "Then maybe he should." Landon's eyes narrowed, something darker flickering beneath his polished demeanor. "That would be unfortunate. For you." The threat landed softly, but it landed all the same. He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Put the folder back exactly where you found it, and I'd suggest you forget anything you saw tonight. It's easier that way." Then he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Imani stood frozen, pulse roaring in her ears. For a split second she thought about abandoning it all, returning the folder, walking away. But then she thought of Noah's sister, of Miles, of the staff who feared losing their jobs for whispering the truth. She couldn't walk away. Not now. She pulled her phone from her pocket and took quick photos of the key documents before returning everything to its original place. She knew now what she hadn't been able to admit before. Sienna was orchestrating this, but she wasn't acting alone. Landon's confidence, his presence at the exact wrong moment, the way he controlled access to the Foundation's accounts, it all connected. He wasn't a bystander. He was complicit. And the deeper Imani went, the clearer it became that the rot wasn't isolated. It was systemic, hiding in plain sight behind a wall of good press and staged philanthropy. Her hands trembled as she backed out of the room and locked the door again. This wasn't just about exposing a bad person anymore. It was about dismantling a lie that touched every corner of Graham's empire. And Imani was the only one holding the truth. That truth, she realized, might be enough to end careers or destroy hers. But either way, it had to come out. She just had to survive long enough to make sure it did. She found a folder labeled with Sienna's name, neat and official, and inside it were documents that felt wrong in her hands. Grant approvals that led nowhere, vendor invoices with suspicious addresses, a foundation account that moved money in loops and never reached the people it claimed to serve. As she turned a page, footsteps sounded outside. Landon Klein, the CFO, entered and froze when he saw her. His face flashed through surprise, then calculation, then a practiced calm. He told her she was in the wrong place, that she could be accused of theft just for standing there. Imani didn't flinch, but her throat burned with panic. Landon's warning carried a truth that made her cold. Sienna was not working alone. Imani had been bracing for consequences since the moment Landon caught her in the charity office. Not in the form of confrontation. That wasn't how people like Landon or Sienna operated. No, she expected a shift in her schedule, a demotion, maybe even a quiet dismissal wrapped in politeness and HR language. But instead, what arrived was a tray. Simple, silver, polished. A post-it note was stuck to the edge with neat handwriting. "Deliver to Mr. Pierce's office, 7:15 p.m. It could have been routine. Staff were often sent with food or drinks, but her name was the only one on the note, and when she reached his private floor, the air felt heavier than usual. Graham opened the door himself. No assistant, no guard. He didn't smile. He didn't ask her to sit. He simply stepped aside and let her in, then closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded far too final. When she turned, he was studying her like someone trying to recognize a face he'd seen in a dream. Familiar, but just out of reach. "What exactly did you see at the gala?" he asked, voice low, not accusing. Imani's heart pounded, but her voice held. "Enough," she said, "more than I wanted to." He leaned back against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. "Tell me," he said, and Imani did. She told him about Noah, how Sienna had accused him with no evidence, how no one dared step in, how fear had spread through the staff like smoke. She told him about Darlene's write-up, the whispered retaliation, the deliberate cruelty that hid behind Sienna's polished smiles. And Graham didn't interrupt. Not once. But as the words left her, his jaw tightened. His eyes dropped briefly to the floor, then back up to her with a different weight. "You're not wrong," he admitted finally, his voice rougher now. "I've felt it, the tension, the change in people around me, but I kept telling myself it was stress, that maybe the staff was overreacting, that Sienna had things under control." Imani didn't let him off the hook. "She doesn't. She's using your name as a weapon." Graham nodded slowly, as if each confirmation carved something deeper into him. "The board's been raising questions for months. Small things, expense anomalies, donations not matching up. But Sienna always had answers, and she's persuasive, publicly generous, efficient." His voice lowered, and I wanted to believe her. He moved to the window, but didn't look out, just stood there, hands in his pockets, like he was afraid of them shaking. "The truth is, I didn't want to deal with what it might mean if she wasn't who she claimed to be. I've built this entire company on trust, on image. If I admit she's part of something corrupt, something that's hurting people, I have to accept I let it happen under my watch." He turned back to face her. "I'm not proud of that." Imani's breath caught, not because of the confession, but because of how honest it sounded. For the first time, he wasn't speaking like a CEO. He was speaking like a man who had made himself blind to avoid breaking what he thought he needed to protect. "Then stop letting it happen," she said. "You have the power to do something, but not if you keep pretending you don't see it." Her words weren't a challenge. They were an offering, a line drawn in the sand, one he could still choose to step across. Graham didn't speak right away. Then finally he said, "I need proof, not rumors, not impressions, hard evidence. Because once this starts, I won't be able to stop it halfway." Imani exhaled slowly. She had expected doubt, maybe even dismissal, but this was different. He wasn't brushing her off. He was inviting her in, into something dangerous, something that could shatter the very structure he stood on. "I have documents," she said carefully, "photocopies, notes, inconsistencies from the foundation accounts, some with Sienna's signature, and Landon, he's not clean either." At that, Graham's eyes narrowed. "Landon?" She nodded. "He caught me in the office, warned me to walk away, not directly, but it was a threat, a quiet one." Graham's posture shifted. His face didn't betray much, but his hands curled slightly at his sides. "I knew there were cracks," he muttered. "I just didn't want to look through them." He paused, then met her eyes again. "Can I trust you, Imani?" She didn't hesitate. "You can trust that I want the truth, even if it costs me." That answer hung in the air between them like something neither could take back. Graham nodded slowly. "Then help me build the case, and when we're ready we'll tear it down, properly, legally." It wasn't a command, it was a request. One made by a man who'd stopped pretending he had all the answers. In that moment, Imani saw something rare in him, guilt that wasn't performative, a kind of regret only possible when you finally stop running from the truth. She wondered how long he had known deep down that Sienna's charm was a mask. How many small incidents he had quietly overlooked in the name of love or comfort or fear. But none of that mattered now. He was standing in front of her, no longer deflecting, no longer hiding behind press releases and polished smiles. He looked like a man facing the weight of his own negligence and deciding finally to do something about it. And in that rarest moment of vulnerability, he had asked for her help, not out of convenience, but necessity. Imani could have said no, could have walked away, protected herself. But instead she nodded once. "Okay," she said, "I'll help you." Not because he was Graham Pierce, but because, for the first time since she'd arrived at the Pierce Grand, he looked like a man willing to stop lying to himself. He admitted that numbers had been off for months, that board members had raised questions, that he had dismissed concerns because Sienna was always so convincing, always so generous in public. But now he couldn't unsee the way she had tried to crush Noah in front of everyone, and he couldn't ignore the fear in his staff's eyes. He told Imani he needed proof before the story became a scandal that destroyed innocent people. He asked for her help, and the request was not a command. It was a vulnerable choice. Imani studied his face and saw guilt there, real and raw. When she agreed, she did it not because he was a billionaire, but because for the first time he looked like a man willing to stop lying to himself. The evidence didn't arrive in a wave. It trickled in, quiet, patient, and undeniable. A donor called the front office asking for an update on a scholarship his family had supposedly funded months ago. He was polite, confused, and just beginning to feel embarrassed. The money had been donated publicly, announced on social media with smiling photos and a big check held by Sienna herself. But the school it was intended for hadn't received a single dollar. The next day, an email intended for Landon was mistakenly forwarded to Imani's account. It was from a community center director in Newark, apologizing profusely for asking again, but desperate to know if the promised funds would ever arrive. The center was running out of time, he wrote, and they'd already put Graham Pierce's name on the new building. Imani stared at the email for several minutes before forwarding it to her burner inbox and deleting it from the company server. These weren't bookkeeping errors. These were victims, real people, real needs, and money that vanished the moment the cameras were gone. What scared her most wasn't how deep the fraud went. It was how easy it had been for Sienna to smile through it all, like she was saving the world. A few days later, a call came to the office line, a restricted number asking for Graham's assistant. The voice on the other end didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, it asked softly, "Is this Imani Reed?" Yeah, there was something brittle and urgent in the way she said the name, something that made Imani pause. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Who's calling?" The woman hesitated. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I know what Sienna Cole did, and I have proof, but I won't speak to just anyone." She gave a time, a location, and then ended the call. No further explanation. Imani didn't ask for permission. She didn't tell Graham or anyone else. That night, she took the subway to a small cafe near the Port Authority, the kind of place people passed without seeing. Evelyn was already there when she arrived, a middle-aged woman in a wrinkled blazer, holding a paper cup with both hands, like it was keeping her from falling apart. Her eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from years of not being believed. "Thank you for coming," Evelyn said, sliding a thin envelope across the table. "You're the first person to ever call me back." Imani opened the envelope with slow, deliberate hands. Inside were photocopies of news clippings, court documents, and a few old photos. She recognized the face in one of them immediately. The hair was darker, the makeup different, but the smile, it was the same. It was Sienna. Except back then, she had gone by the name Caroline Dent. Imani's breath caught in her throat. She scanned the top headline: "Non-profit director under investigation for embezzlement." The article detailed a scandal involving a children's literacy foundation in New Jersey, one that had collapsed after hundreds of thousands in donations disappeared. Caroline Dent had been named as the prime suspect before vanishing during the investigation. She never showed up to court. Evelyn leaned in, voice trembling. "My brother worked for that foundation. He believed in it. He vouched for her. She made him CFO, said she needed someone she could trust. When it all came crashing down, she left him behind to take the fall." Imani looked up. Evelyn's eyes filled with a quiet, exhausted rage. "He did time, Imani. He lost everything. And then, poof, she disappeared, rebranded, re-emerged in Manhattan with a new name, new hair, new life. No one believed me, but I never stopped watching." Imani couldn't speak. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had moved in without warning. The pattern was too clean to ignore. This wasn't just mismanagement or corporate coldness. This was a blueprint. Sienna, or Caroline, had done this before. She built institutions with charm, weaponized trust, then hollowed them out and walked away just before the cracks became visible. The charity fraud at the Pierce Grand wasn't her first scheme. It was her perfected one. "Why come forward now?" Imani asked, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Evelyn looked down at her cup. "Because I saw her on television again, standing next to Graham Pierce, smiling like a saint. And I realized if someone didn't stop her, more people would suffer. And because you..." Her gaze sharpened. "You're not afraid of her. I've been watching." Imani swallowed the knot in her throat. She felt both honored and crushed. Being brave sounded noble until you realized someone else had pinned their last hopes to you. She slipped the documents into her bag and nodded. "I'll do something," she said. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. Evelyn exhaled, a tiny release of breath, like she'd been holding it for years. They stood to leave at the same time. Evelyn squeezed her arm gently, then walked away without another word. Imani lingered for a moment, needing time to process the weight of what she now carried. Her hands trembled slightly as she zipped her bag, her mind spinning with next steps, verifying the court records, cross-referencing donor accounts, confronting Landon, confronting Graham. But as she reached for the door, she caught a glimpse in the cafe window. At first, she thought it was her own reflection. Then her heart stuttered. Across the street, standing half-shadowed behind a lamppost, was a woman in a long beige coat, wearing oversized designer sunglasses. The angle was wrong for a clear view, but Imani knew. She felt it in her chest before her mind caught up. The way the woman's head tilted slightly, the stillness in her posture. It was Sienna, watching, waiting. Maybe she hadn't heard the conversation. Maybe she didn't know what was in the envelope. But she knew something had shifted. Imani didn't react. She just stepped into the street and kept walking like she hadn't seen anything at all, even though her skin burned under the pressure of being seen. Inside were clippings and court documents from years ago, tied to a fraud case involving a non-profit in New Jersey, a scandal that wrecked families and disappeared from headlines almost as quickly as it appeared. The name on the old report was not Sienna Cole. It was another name, one with the same face attached in a grainy photo. Evelyn's voice shook as she said Sienna had destroyed her brother's life, that no one believed them because the woman responsible had vanished and reinvented herself. Imani felt the room tilt. This was not just cruelty. This was a pattern. And as she stood to leave, she caught a reflection in the cafe window, a woman outside in designer sunglasses watching. Sienna wasn't just ahead of them, she was close. Sienna didn't wait for the tides to shift. She built her battlefield. The grand reopening of the Pierce Grand Ballroom had all the trimmings of a perfect distraction. Photographers stationed near velvet ropes, politicians drinking cocktails under antique chandeliers, and glossy banners that read like promises, rebuilding hope, one donation at a time. But beneath the glitter, everyone involved in Graham's quiet investigation knew this wasn't a celebration. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Graham had tightened internal security, stationed trusted staff on key access points, and kept media briefings brief. Imani moved through the crowd in black formal wear, professional and unnoticed, her notes pressed against her skin like a second layer of armor. Every step she took carried the weight of the files she had collected, the names she couldn't forget, and the lines she knew had been crossed. For a single moment, as she watched Graham give a reserved smile to a news anchor, she let herself believe they might pull this off, gather the final piece, expose the theft, protect the staff, and force accountability into the light. But that belief lasted only minutes. Because Sienna had come prepared too. It happened fast and with surgical efficiency. A shriek from the VIP wing, a frantic assistant claiming that an emerald necklace had gone missing, a room full of speculation before a single fact was confirmed. And then, too conveniently, the item was found in Imani's service cart, tucked under folded napkins she hadn't touched. The speed with which the accusation spread was chilling. Guests were pulled aside, security alerted. Sienna emerged moments later, flanked by 2 board members and an air of dignified distress. "I hate to even suggest it," she said to the hotel director, "but with donors in the building we can't afford to appear negligent. We have to be thorough." She didn't demand Imani's arrest. That would have looked too aggressive. Instead, she called for clarity, for responsibility. Within minutes, police were called. Imani barely registered the officer's presence before the words, "Step aside, ma'am," made her chest lock up. She couldn't move. Not because she was guilty, because she'd been here before, in different ways. Foster homes, shelter checkpoints, nights walking home when patrol cars slowed down just enough to make her feel cornered. She froze as one officer pulled out cuffs. "This is just procedure," he said. The metal snapped around her wrists before she could find words. The cold was sharp, but not unfamiliar. What struck her wasn't the pain, it was the heat that bloomed across her chest, the humiliation. Eyes watched her, phones hovered, guests whispered with pity, laced in performance. Somewhere in the distance, Sienna's voice rang out, "I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding." That was the line, crafted to look gracious while implying guilt. Imani's breath grew shallow. She felt the years she had clawed through collapsing in on her like a bad dream returning mid-step. And then she found Graham's eyes. He was already pushing through the crowd, no security, no PR handler beside him. He looked at her first, not the officers, not the donors, just her, their eyes locked. Imani didn't speak, she didn't beg. But something in her gaze asked one simple question: will you protect your image, or will you protect me? Graham didn't shout. He didn't posture. He stepped in front of the lead officer and said clearly and with authority, "I want the security footage pulled now, body cam included." No decisions until then. The officers hesitated. Sienna took a step forward, expression tightening. "Graham, this isn't the time." "It is," he cut her off. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. The officers looked to their supervisor, who nodded once. A tech was called in to access internal surveillance. While the ballroom buzzed with discomfort, Imani stood still, wrists bound, eyes burning. She refused to shrink. Not this time. Not for this woman. When the footage came in, the silence cracked wide open. It showed exactly what Imani had predicted. Sienna entering the charity office 2 nights prior, removing specific files, handing a folder to Landon. Later, the same woman planting something into the service cart, using a towel as cover. The footage was damning. It also showed Sienna adjusting her dress and smiling directly into a hallway mirror after the act, as if proud of the theater she'd staged. The lead officer turned toward Imani with sudden urgency. "We need to remove the cuffs," he said. "Now!" As the restraints were unfastened, Imani's hands throbbed red, skin pulsing where the metal had bitten. She didn't flinch. She simply stepped back, breathing deeply, reclaiming space that had been stolen from her in seconds. Graham stood beside her. For the first time, his expression wasn't careful. It was devastated. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he turned to Sienna, who stood still as stone, arms crossed but eyes now visibly wide. "We're done," he said. Just 2 words, but they struck with finality. This engagement, this lie, this performance, it ends here. You used my name to hurt people, and I let you. That ends now. Sienna blinked but said nothing. She didn't fight back, didn't protest. She just turned slowly and began walking away, heels clicking like punctuation marks in a scene she no longer controlled. The donors didn't follow. The press didn't ask questions. And for once, no one applauded. The illusion had cracked open wide enough for everyone to see. Graham looked down at Imani's wrists. His mouth opened, then closed. "I'm sorry," he said at last, the words breaking instead of flowing. Imani gave a small nod. Her throat ached, but she stayed upright. There was no catharsis in the moment, only clarity. She had survived something cruel, and now the cleanup would begin. Legal, financial, emotional, but for the first time, it would begin in truth. The footage cleared Imani and exposed the setup. It also revealed something worse: Sienna entering the charity office late at night, taking files, meeting with Landon. The police uncuffed Imani, but the marks on her wrists stayed red, a painful reminder of how easily lives are damaged. Graham looked at her hands, as if he felt every ounce of what she'd endured. When he turned to Sienna, his voice didn't rise. It broke. He told her the engagement was over, right there, under the same light she had used to perform kindness. The scandal didn't leak. It erupted. By morning, the Pierce Grand wasn't just a luxury hotel. It was ground zero. News vans parked outside like vultures, camera lenses pointed at the lobby as if waiting to catch someone breaking. Headlines screamed variations of the same question: how did Graham Pierce let this happen? Reporters scoured every inch of internet history, dragging up photos of Sienna at past galas, questioning every award, donation and headline she'd ever curated. Some whispered about Imani, about how close she'd gotten to Graham, about her sudden promotion, about what she might have done to turn him against his fiancée. Sienna's team released a carefully worded statement, one that danced just shy of outright slander. She claimed persecution. She suggested manipulation. And she did what people like her always did. She made herself the victim without getting her hands dirty. In courtrooms and conference rooms, Imani sat still while people argued around her like she was a case file, not a person. They questioned her motives, her qualifications, her past. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. Every time her voice wanted to rise, she gripped her notebook instead, the one filled with timelines, receipts, copies, and truths. Her spine stayed straight, her purpose rooted. Graham had a choice, and for once he chose the hard path, the expensive one, the right one. He didn't wait for the PR team to spin it. He fired Landon publicly, citing breach of fiduciary duty. He released a formal statement acknowledging the fraud, apologizing to every donor and beneficiary affected, and invited third-party auditors into the foundation's finances. When the board pushed back, urging him to settle things quietly and protect the brand, he pushed harder. "The brand is worthless if it's a lie," he said in a recorded meeting that later went viral. Restitution agreements were drafted, funds were rerouted. Graham personally called the heads of the organizations impacted. When he met Evelyn Hart in person, he didn't bring lawyers. He brought coffee. He listened while she recounted how her brother's life had been gutted by Caroline Dent, Sienna's former identity. Evelyn didn't forgive him, not exactly, but when she walked out, her face had changed. Some of the bitterness had shifted into something heavier, grief, real, worn grief. Imani stood just outside the door, watching Graham sit alone for several minutes after Evelyn left, his hands clasped like a man praying not to repeat his sins. Later that week, Graham stepped into the staff break room unannounced. There was no camera crew, no prepared statement, just him in a quiet room where people once feared to speak. He looked around at the employees, some still unsure if they could trust him, and said, "I let my guard down where I should have paid attention. I let charm blind me to harm, and I'm sorry." He didn't elaborate. He didn't cry. He didn't turn it into a speech. It was just a man admitting failure and asking, without demanding, to do better. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Darlene, standing near the coffee machine, blinked hard and wiped at her eyes. "Took you long enough," she muttered, voice cracking. There was no sarcasm in it, only release. Others nodded, some still cautious, some relieved. That apology, real and unpolished, carried weight no press conference ever could. Graham left quietly, giving the room back to them. Imani stayed behind. She didn't need to speak. She just took a seat, and for the first time, no one moved away. The changes weren't overnight, but they were real. Job protections were rewritten. A staff advocacy board was formed. The hush that used to fill the hotel corridors began to fade. Imani returned to work like she always had, with purpose. But something in her posture had shifted. She was no longer walking on borrowed ground. She was standing in something she helped rebuild. Noah approached her 2 days later, holding his phone like it was made of glass. "She's up," he whispered, eyes bright. It took Imani a second to understand. Then she saw the screen. Lily, his sister, in a hospital gown, upright in bed, smiling and holding a cup of juice like it was a trophy. Imani covered her mouth, breath hitching, eyes flooding before she could stop them. It wasn't about redemption. It wasn't even about winning. It was about knowing that something survived the damage, something good. She hugged Noah without words, their shoulders shaking from everything that hadn't been said and didn't need to be. They sat in the corner of the break room while others passed by, smiling, patting Noah on the back, whispering, "Thank God," like it was the only phrase that made sense. Graham walked in briefly, caught sight of them, and paused. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded once, not in approval, but acknowledgement, like he saw the truth now and had learned to sit with it. Imani let the tears fall, quiet and unashamed. It wasn't about her. It had never been just about her, but she had taken the weight when no one else would. She had carried it through fear, through isolation, through being misunderstood, and now, in the simplest of ways, it was beginning to matter. The hotel wasn't fixed. The press still swirled. Legal messes still waited. But here, in this moment, there was peace. Not the silence of fear, but the stillness after a storm, when breath returns and people look each other in the eye without flinching. Darlene cried, not loudly, but with the exhausted relief of someone who had carried too much alone. Noah brought a photo of Lily sitting up in her hospital bed, and when he showed it to Imani, she covered her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. It wasn't romance that filled the room. It was restoration. Months later, the Pierce Grand still stood tall, its glass gleaming as if untouched by scandal. To the outside world, it looked unchanged. Valets still opened doors, executives still arrived in sleek cars, and high-profile events still graced the grand ballroom. But for the people inside, something fundamental had shifted. There was space to breathe, space to speak. The silence that once ruled had been broken. Graham followed through on everything he promised. The Staff Advocacy Office was no PR stunt. It had its own space, its own team, and most importantly, its own authority. And he hadn't offered it to Imani as a gesture. He had offered it because she'd earned it with action, with courage, and with an unflinching dedication to truth. Imani didn't say yes right away. She had conditions, written protections, an anonymous reporting channel, a direct line to the board, nothing symbolic. Real safeguards. Graham agreed to every word. And so, on her first official day in the role, she hung a single framed photo on the wall of her office. It wasn't an award or a certificate. It was a picture of Miles, still smiling, still waiting. It was why she had survived all of it, why she couldn't be bought, why she never backed down. The work was exhausting in new ways. She listened to people's stories, often in whispers, stories about retaliation, about years of feeling invisible. She advocated for promotions that had long been denied, for wages owed, for the dignity too often deferred. But for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't fighting a system from the outside. She was reshaping it from within. Graham checked in rarely, and when he did, it wasn't to supervise, it was to support. He understood that trust now meant stepping back. In meetings, he credited the team instead of himself. At staff dinners, he sat at the same tables, word spread. Employees from other hotels in the chain began requesting copies of the new policy manual. A ripple had started. Imani felt it in every email she received from someone brave enough to speak out, in every tearful thank you from staff who had finally been heard. But even as she built something new at work, her heart kept circling back to a different promise, the one made in whispers, years ago, in the dark of a foster home hallway, where a scared girl told her little brother, "Hold on, I'll come back for you." That promise had carried her further than anything else ever had. The court date came quicker than she expected. Legal guardianship required more than emotion. It needed paperwork, background checks, affidavits, and 1,000 questions she had to answer without blinking. Imani passed every test. Still, as she sat in the back of the courtroom beside Miles, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. They sat close, knees touching, neither speaking much. He had grown taller, older, more guarded, but he still reached for her hand just before the judge entered, and she squeezed it like a lifeline. The proceedings were brief. The paperwork had been processed. The judge asked a few final questions, then paused. Imani's chest tightened until he spoke. "I see no reason not to grant this petition. Effective immediately, legal guardianship is transferred to Miss Imani Reed." Miles didn't move. For a moment he just stared ahead, as if waiting for someone to say it was a mistake. Then he turned slowly to her. "It's real?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Imani nodded, throat too tight to speak. His breath hitched, just once, but loud enough for her to hear that he had been holding it in for far too long. She signed her name on the dotted line with steady hands, like she was carving it into something permanent. Outside, the sun had already begun to dip, and the courthouse steps were quieter than she expected. Graham was waiting near the bottom, hands in his coat pockets, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. He didn't step forward to meet her. He let her approach at her own pace. There was no audience, no cameras, just 3 people who had chosen to show up for each other in different ways. Graham smiled and pulled a small object from his pocket. "This is for you," he said. Imani took it, confused, until she saw the tag attached to the key ring. Reed. Just that. No title. No instructions. "It's for your new place," he explained. "Lease is in your name. Miles is on it too, and before you ask, no strings, no favors owed." She stared at the key, blinking fast. "You didn't have to—" "I know," he interrupted. "That's why I did." Miles stayed close beside her, silent but present. Imani looked between them, then down at the key again. It wasn't about the apartment. It was about having something of her own, something no one could take away. She and Miles didn't speak much on the ride home. He stared out the window, hands in his lap, the way kids do when they're afraid to believe too much. But just before they reached their new building, he turned to her. "So, what happens now?" he asked. Imani smiled, not because she had the perfect answer, but because she didn't need one. "Now," she said, "we start small. Groceries, school, figuring out how to not kill the plants Graham left in the kitchen." He laughed, genuinely, and that sound alone felt like redemption. When they stepped into the apartment, it smelled like paint and possibility, a blank canvas. Miles walked straight to the bedroom that was now his and closed the door softly, not in anger, but in ownership. Imani leaned against the wall and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. She had jobs ahead, hard ones, but right now she had given someone a home, and in doing so, maybe, finally, she'd given that to herself too. Imani looked at Miles, then at the key, and something inside her unclenched. She had come to Manhattan for a job. She was leaving that courthouse with a family, with a promise fulfilled, with the kind of beginning that didn't erase pain, but finally gave it a place to rest. What did this story awaken in you? Share it in the comments. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and like. When you do, you help us keep creating new stories with the care and time they truly take. And if you'd like more, explore our other videos. We'd love to hear from you.